Throughout his works, Adorno draws attention to the limitations of the Kantian moral imperative to act with universality in mind when considering how, during the Holocaust, a destructive drive had become entirely indifferent about whether it had been directed at others or against its own subject. For Adorno, acting with a moral maxim of universality
Wunderbare Regiment des deutschen Volkes und unserer Bewegung meinen Namen trägt.
implodes when, perhaps through a feeling like ressentiment or a calculative logic of a reductionist form of Darwinism. Adorno states, the law to promote other people's happiness does thus not spring from the premise that this is an object for everyone's license. Its source is simply that the form of universality, which reason needs as a condition for investing a maxim of self-love with the object validity of a law, comes to be the determining cause of the will. With a rationale about how increasing population levels lead to increasing food scarcity, Thomas Malthus is said to have influenced the work of Charles Darwin. Yet, if we take seriously the role of cultural contexts, both these thinkers are products of their Victorian times. Quoting Mark Fisher, as any number of radical theorists from Brecht through to Foucault and Badiou have maintained, emancipatory politics must always destroy the appearance of a natural order, must reveal what is presented as necessary and inevitable to be a mere contingency, just as it must make what was previously deemed to be impossible seem attainable. Within this backdrop, Darwin and Malthus developed theories that helped acculturate politicized forms of the natural life. This particular reading of Darwin elicits the same kind of biases towards the survivalist appetites for securitization needed for rationalizing the replacement of self-organizing markets with centrally planned corporate economies.
One of the jewels of the British Raj. No stranger to commerce and trade, it's a city that has wholeheartedly embraced the new capitalism. A city where even the billboards urge punters to invest. Nowhere is the frenzied energy of Bombay business shown more than here at the stock exchange. Brokers pray for luck just to survive as they enter the human maelstrom of the trading floor, now the busiest in the world.
And the replacing of diverse cultures with cultures of greed and materialism. Perhaps this formulation is a useful designation for the term neoliberalism. The Second World War once again brought these questions of social Darwinism to the fore, while serving to exemplify how the absurdly rational may not necessarily lead to a purely economic scientism. The war threw German identity into a double crisis. First, the question was asked about what it meant to be German after an identity was so integrally tied to the other. The second question was about why the decision was made to intensify the operations of the death camps, even though it would have diverted resources from the war effort.
If the last couple of years had allowed Schindler to be ambivalent about the Nazis to avoid taking anyone's side, 1942 would be the year that everyone had to choose.
Arendt attempted to comprehend leaders like Eichmann as having an inability to think, namely, to think from the standpoint of somebody else. Yet her contentions regarding the banality of evil does not bode well in light of later research. From a Nazi rationale, the new general understanding had become that the death camps were applied science. For example, by focusing on killers who had the opportunity to say no, Daniel Goldhagen dispels all notions that paint Germans as being ignorant to the plight of the Jews, and that those who were committing these acts of murder did so reluctantly. Quote, "The matters of economy would not dictate German rationality in their treatment of the Jews. Economic self-injury generally worried or deterred neither Hitler nor the lowliest camp guard." Though the Holocaust is seen as a failure of humanity, there is a debate about whether such an event is exceptional, since justifications given for the atrocities did not differ greatly from a discourse of utility that existed prior, as was the case for legitimizing the destruction of the Heroros people.
Some of them would chop off the prisoners' heads and then throw the rest of their bodies in the water to feed the sharks. When I think about this history, it makes me sad and bitter.
From 1899 to 1902, the British Imperial Army attacked the white farmers of the South African Republic and Orange Free State to gain control over the mining areas.
Or in the Ottoman or British empires, as Michael Rothberg explains in Multidirectional Memory. Quote, "It is difficult to grasp how the elimination of one alien presence is more irrational than the other. The establishment of pragmatism and utility as standards of historical distinction in this instance presupposes European frameworks of evaluation. How a simple common sense logic for utility can reach such unfathomable conclusions perhaps drives our insatiable need to comprehend such collective trauma."
More difficult. I mean, we are part of, I would say, the process of collective cultural reflection.
How Arendt permits herself to only impersonate the manifest shallowness of totalitarianism, while insisting in her works of the non-utilitarian values that motivate the destruction that took place, exemplifies this unfathomability.
That I have called the banality of evil.
The fissures between our faculties reiterates these aporias. A common critical response to the privileging of the Holocaust is to claim uniqueness or primacy for other histories of suffering, such as African American slavery or the genocide of the Native Americans. While such efforts have helped raise the profile of these related neglected histories, they are historically problematic as well as politically and ethically unproductive. Here we can follow an admonishment from Henri Bergson, which will work to sharpen this guilt with regards to the failures of humanity. Quote, "Following the indications of speech,
these signature whistles fill the ocean with glistening speech bubbles. It's a magical sight.
Will doubtless define feelings by the way which we are associated, love for one's family, love for one's country, love of mankind. It will see that in these three inclinations, one single feeling, growing ever larger to embrace an increasing number of persons. What Bergson sees as an intellectualist oversight may have been what had contributed to the clouding of Arendt's judgment, rendering her unable to take seriously the the simple steps that were taken in order to reach logical, totalitarian conclusions. This oversight is one that sees cosmopolitanism as a clear extension of nationalism, when in reality they could very well be two incommensurable concepts that have failed to reach any sort of reconciliation. Bergson explains that the mistake lies in the conflation between what we presume to be a difference in degree, in terms of the size of the community we choose to take responsibility for, with what may actually be a difference in kind. Cosmopolitanism requires an extra intellectualist effort that does not actually affectively resonate with the masses. So, a conflict emerges between these liberal-minded cosmopolitan intellectuals and those that prefer nationalism and or ethnicity, who label such intellectualists as advocating globalism.
Did you come down here to create a lie and get one of my people shot? Oh, no, really? You create the narrative, sweetheart.
You have been captured by somebody's narrative warfare, and you think it's your own thinking.
Let's be honest with ourselves out here, sir. You never met a woman like me, huh?
In explaining how the cultural idiom of "don't talk to strangers" has become the strategic precept of adult normality,
you've already been told about strangers dressing up in uniforms.
Instead, he became a police officer in Oklahoma City. Now he could face life in prison after being convicted of sexually assaulting 13 women. It went on for months.
Good evening. I'm David Muir.
And I'm Elizabeth Vargas. How many of us have felt the dread of being pulled over by a policeman? Maybe going too fast, a taillight that's out. It could be anything. But now a group of women who say that they had a very different reason to be afraid.
In the heart of Tornado Alley in 2014, Oklahoma has an easy year, less than 20 twisters. But in Oklahoma City, the police department is getting slammed with a man-made disaster.
Oklahoma City Police confirmed they are investigating this claim.
The force rocked by allegations against one of its own. Officer Daniel Holdsclaw is preying on those he's sworn to serve and protect.
This is the quiet little town of Allgood, but is it really all good?
You've already been told about strangers dressing up in uniforms, but there are other traps you need to know about.
Hi, I lost my little dog. Can you help me find him?
Be suspicious of an adult asking for help.
You guys are calling the police and calling us pedophiles. I'm a professional skateboarder. I have free shit. I'm just my old board and my old wheels to these kids. And these people are saying that we're pedophiles.
Damn, that's just hard.
Tonight, the Six Sad World Primetime Special.
In explaining how the cultural idiom of "don't talk to strangers" has become the strategic precept of adult normality, Bauman concurs with Bergman's healthy skepticism towards the view that communitarianism is a rational response to the genuine crisis of public space. As Germany in the Second World War came to exemplify, through its own fundamentalism, sometimes the metanarrative that remains the most credible between conflicting paradigms fuels an absolutism that takes the form of defending an ethnicity or nation. In the field of international relations, this state of exception comes out of an anarchic world which lacks any supreme sovereign authority. China's recent global reach through economic and military expansion, while serving as the ultimate counterexample to the liberal coupling of economic growth and political freedom, connects concerns of foreign policy with local-level questions of civic participation. Rui Pingfan's Renaissance of Confucianism in Contemporary China reminds us of these rifts. Quote, "Many in the West are so fully embedded in their moral and political understandings that they take for granted that their moral intuitions reflect a global, moral, and political theoretical common ground. In different ways, Such presuppositions sustain the ideologies of such diverse parties as social democrats and neoconservatives.
Did actually happen in China. And who are these strange revolutionaries? What did they know of Mao Zedong's real intentions? From where did such religious fanaticism come? Such blind readiness to destroy the party and state apparatus, to disorganize the world order?
The universality of these assumptions is radically falsified by China, which constitutes a moral, social, and political counterexample. China and her culture are nested in a life world with a moral and political thought style substantively different from that of the West. Though critiques of Orientalism have increased sensitivities about exporting Eurocentric ideas, these two frames of reference are still stranded in the same aporias existing between colonial histories, looming ecological crises, and the confusion of thousands of simultaneous and contesting paradigms. While the contested history of the museum was perhaps supposed to serve as another space of liberal reflection and civic education, it instead reaches another aphoretic impasse when museum directors complain about the stealing of antiques by Chinese efforts. These complaints fall on deaf ears when there is a reminder that much of these valuables were acquired through colonial plunder in the first place. As the scholar Atiyah explains, European countries and their museums should be prepared for more ex-colonial nations around the world to demand the return of stolen goods and to begin to let go of their colonial past, literally.
In 1897, after the British launched a punitive expedition against the African Empire in search of booty, and Nigeria has suggested it might be prepared to borrow them back. It's a different story for Greece, who won't accept anything less than the wholesale return of the Elgin marbles. The relief sculptures, which once adorned the Parthenon and other buildings on Athens' Acropolis, were taken by Scottish nobleman Lord Elgin at the start of the 19th century. At the time, he obtained permission from the Ottoman authorities who occupied the country, but the Greeks have always dismissed that as a dodgy deal. And far from just being conducted by scholars and politicians, the debate is taking place online. Indians have recently taken to Twitter to demand the return of cultural monuments like this sandstone sculpture of Harihara, dating back around 1,000 years. It was taken from a Hindu temple by a British collector in the East India Company and auctioned off after his death in 1828. Unlike French President Emmanuel Macron, who supports the idea of returning historical artifacts to former French colonies, the British Museum refuses to budge. They argue that emptying European institutions of their colonial treasures simply doesn't work. For a start, disentangling rightful ownership isn't always possible. Moreover, lots of museums are prevented from deaccessioning objects by UK law. It seems this is a moral debate that won't be buried for some time.
And we can look to Agamben when he explains the crisis that Europe is going through, as should be evident in the dismantling of its university institutions and in its growing museification of culture, is not an economic problem. Economy today is a shibboleth and not a concept, but a crisis of the relationship with the past, since obviously the only place in which the past can live is the present. If the present is no longer aware of its past as living, then universities and museums become problematic places. And if art has today become for us an eminent figure, perhaps the eminent figure of the past, then the question that we must never stop posing is, what is the place of art in the present? Likewise, educational institutions are in a similar bind as they ask how academic presses can simultaneously engage with China and maintain their integrity, given the attempt of Chinese authorities to create sanitized versions of top academic journals.
He's joined a long and growing list of celebrities, public figures, and companies that have been punished for hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. Katy Perry, Selena Gomez, Bon Jovi, Maroon 5, Versace, Marriott, the list goes on. People outside of mainland China now have to watch what they say, or risk losing access to China's huge and still growing consumer market. The result is that Chinese censorship is affecting everyone, including you. We're traveling around the world to find out how China is changing basically everything.
As the news article explains, facing intense criticism for caving to censors, Cambridge University Press restores access to more than 300 journal articles it had blocked in China. But the problem for publishers isn't going away. Chinese authorities also try to block articles from other journals as well. While in English, the word for censorship implies something like a suppression of information, the Chinese implication is more akin to a supervision, a legalistic review system. Perhaps President Obama's warnings in the January 2010 State of the Union address is a precursor for the need to implement similar supervision systems.
But we can't stop there. It's time to require lobbyists to disclose each contact they make on behalf of a client with my administration or with Congress. It's time to put strict limits on the contributions that lobbyists give to candidates for federal office. With all due deference to separation of powers, last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections. I don't think American elections should be bankrolled by America's most powerful interests, or worse, by foreign entities.
Years later,
they should be decided by the American people.
Had become exposed to a plethora of issues related to such incursions into social media platforms. As Zuckerman writes, Macedonian teenagers create sensational and false content to profit from online ads.
Cashing in on the success of fake news entrepreneurs, who get paid relatively majestic sums by Macedonian standards by selling advertising on their sites.
What happened in our town is that a lot of money came, and a lot of people quit their jobs, so they can put a lot of effort in this, as they saw this as the big idea, as their big chance, the big change in their life.
One venue here even plans to host a club night on the day Google pays out its ad revenue.
Disinformation experts plan rallies and counter-rallies, calling Americans into the streets to scream at one another. Botnets amplify posts and hashtags, building the appearance of momentum behind online campaigns like Release the Memo. We become aware of how uncomfortable this model is when Steve Bannon and Cambridge Analytica develop personality profiles of us so they can tailor persuasive messages to our specific personal quirks.
Carry water for him then?
I've been doing this for 10 years. I've been working on this populist national for 10 years.
So President Trump is the vehicle for that?
No, President Trump is our leader. I'm a huge believer in his presidency, and I'm even a bigger believer in this populist nationalist movement, and this is all on the line.
But that's exactly what any competent advertiser is doing every day on nearly every site online.
Tell your doctor right away if your depression worsens, you have unusual changes in behavior, or thoughts of suicide. Antidepressants can increase these in children, teens, and young adults. Cymbalta is not approved for children under 18. People taking MAOIs or thyroidazine, or with uncontrolled glaucoma should not take Cymbalta. Taking it with NSAID pain relievers, aspirin, or blood thinners may increase bleeding risk. Severe liver problems, some fatal, were reported. Signs include abdominal pain and yellowing of the skin or eyes.
Nikola Spasov, the Balkan representative for Cambridge Analytica, then demonstrates the complications involved in dichotomous views of whether sovereignty operates from an outside or inside, as well as the line between legality and illegality, by stating, absolutely no illegal methods were used in those campaigns. On the contrary, they were conducted professionally, according to top world standards, using advanced research and communication tools. Just as museums seem to be in no position to point out wrongdoing.
The CIA has accused Russia of trying to meddle in the U.S. presidential election in order to elect Donald Trump. But this could be a classic case of the pot calling the kettle black. The CIA itself knows a thing or two about how to influence foreign elections.
By increasingly operating as if it was a corporation, not to mention having a history of unjustified interventionism in countries like Iran and Nicaragua. Western governments themselves seem to have historically sold off their moral authority when it comes to attempting to regulate such activity through the rise of a highly organized private sector and its institutionalized participation in policy making. This is well illustrated when we compare the work of Darren Acemoglu and James A. Robinson, who discuss the political and economic evolution of Venice during the Middle Ages in Why Nations Fail, with Michael J. Greats and Ian Shapiro's meticulous investigation into the history of how the United States estate tax was repealed in 2001 in their Death by 1,000 Cuts.
As a result, respect for America stands high in the world today. And thanks to your courage and your leadership, the fire of individual freedom burns more brightly, not just in America, not just in the West, but right across the world.
As part of a broader Republican anti-tax crusade, this repeal was one of the multiple campaigns to reduce the size and functions of American government. In the dedication of their work to Boris E. Bitker, whose writings on the estate tax almost cost him tenure, Greats and Shapiro reiterate Neil Postman's comments about the difficulty of assuming neutrality, for there is an elite class actively engaging in their own version of academic regulation, even in the land of the free.
But it's easy enough to bracket the immorality of one's nation, and even some academic moral and political philosophy, as well as lots of economics, especially Chicago School economics, has arisen to assist in that endeavor.
So I was not an advisor to Pinochet, I was not an advisor to the Chilean government, but I am more than willing to share in the credit for the extraordinary job that our students did down there.
These works show how, though it may be possible to assume that the maintenance of inclusive institutions were foundational to the economic prosperity of both the United States and Venice, as opposed to more hierarchical institutions like private schools and gated communities in neighborhoods with even moderate levels of income, there is always a tangible temptation to actively enclose avenues towards social mobility from those who have already achieved positions of privilege.
Pretend that none of this matters because in the land of opportunity, everybody has a chance to make it. But in fact, social mobility is lower here than in many other developed countries, and it's been going down. Aristocrats take wealth out of productive activities and invest it in walls. They lock themselves and their offspring in place at the expense of other people's children. The escalating inequality of our time appears new, but if you take in a broad sweep of history, starting, say, with the Great Pyramids of Egypt, inequality looks like the norm of human experience. History tells us that aristocrats come to believe in their own propaganda, that their superiority is an artifact of nature.
Quote, economic growth supported by the inclusive Venetian institutions was accompanied by creative destruction. Each new wave of enterprising young men who became rich via the Commenda or other similar economic institutions tended to reduce the profits and economic success of established elites. And they did not just reduce their profits, they also challenged their political power. Thus, there was always a temptation, if they could get away with it, for the existing elites sitting in the Great Council to close down the system to these new people. Long-term socioeconomic and political factionalism can also be found in Shapiro's work Political Representation, with discussions about both overt and benign forms of racial segregation. Practices of redlining, which lowered down payments and interest rates while giving loan guarantees to white home buyers on the condition that their home be sited in racially exclusive enclaves, again illustrated these barriers. Such restrictive covenants upheld by a 1948 Supreme Court ruling then would see various implicit reiterations through to the present, would read as follows. None of said lands, interests therein, or improvements thereon shall be sold, resold, conveyed, leased, rented to, or in any way used, occupied, or acquired by any person of Negro blood, or to any person of the Semitic race, blood, or origin, which racial description shall be deemed to include Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, or Syrians. With all these incursions into inclusive democratic processes, of which there can be countless other examples, in The State of Democratic Theory, Ian Shapiro joins Slavoj Zizek and Raymond Goyce in questioning the plausibility of liberal civic ideals by highlighting how the popular notion that everyone should be given a voice can itself become a source which can obstruct, procrastinate, and stonewall, preventing change. He cites Rousseau to explain how he argued long ago that allegiance to sectional societies is more likely to undermine than reinforce commitment to collective institutions. Using the implications of findings in what is called relative deprivation theory, where people compare themselves relative to proximity rather than to an absolute, choosing, for example, to have the best home in a less attractive neighborhood than to have the worst home in the better area. Shapiro describes how there is a reluctance to identify with disadvantaged groups.
But interestingly enough, oftentimes when people are committing crimes in a community that borders a more affluent one, they don't always cross over into the more wealthy neighborhood to rob or break the law. Oftentimes they prey upon the people living in their own neighborhood. So there's a point on your slide here that says that criminals are motivated by perceived humiliation and in turn feel the right to humiliate their victim, usually poor people. So they feel deprived, they're angry, they're bitter, they're resentful, but they know that there are consequences if they victimize people who have more. So they turn that rage and that humiliation on their neighbors and they victimize them instead.
It is also not obvious how to differentiate the Boy Scouts from the Hitler Youth on that count.
Okay, so why can't we trust any of the things that normally look like sense-making? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, but basically we learned how to do signaling for intentional game theoretic purposes. And so rather than just share signal that is true and representative, we share signal that will advantage some rivalrous agenda. So most signal ends up being that. And one of the things that you were just saying is, or consequence of it is that there's an ethic to not fuck up the information ecology. Mm-hmm. Right? Like in the same way that we say don't pollute, and most people are pretty comfortable with don't throw your cigarette butt on the ground. Don't actually disinform anybody else for your own getting ahead or withhold information where you can avoid doing so, because you're actually disempowering the sense-making of others in the process. And to really be tuned into is though, as I'm seeking to make sense, I want to increase other people's sovereignty and their capacity to make sense. So I want to increase the intactness of the information ecology they're exposed to rather than decrease it.
Shapiro does, however, provide at least one factor to look out for when differentiating between the two. The goal should be to reshape such constraints where possible so that at the margins, identities evolve in ways that are more rather than less hospitable to democratic politics.
You say quit?
That's right, Mr. Mack.
And he said he wasn't coming back.
There is no pay for Judd McIntyre. The hours aren't so good, and sometimes, in spite of his best efforts, the results are discouraging.
Give us a scope of what we're talking about.
Well, basically, we've estimated that as of December 2010, somewhere between 21 and $32 trillion is basically parked offshore. That's private financial wealth. About 90% of it is probably tax-free, not reported to the source countries. So it's a major black hole in the global economy, and it has lots of consequences. Tax Justice Network has been concerned about tax justice issues related to the offshore industry for a decade, but this is the first time we've really tried to pull together the best estimates from everywhere, and we've estimated this number several ways.
Concurring with Shapiro regarding tax havens, Latour writes, "For the first time, a large-scale movement no longer claims to address geopolitical realities seriously, but purports to put itself explicitly outside of all worldly constraints, literally offshore, like a tax haven." In the book Down to Earth, Bruno Latour attempts to lay the groundwork for an appeal to our collective responsibilities by discussing the demands and questions asked of so-called us by an ecological crisis, which is perhaps the only universal paradigm, as all forms of belonging are undergoing metamorphosis.
I'm here with my community, my family. I love these people. It's awesome here.
But the camp is a contentious fixture in the neighborhood, and it's a clear display of the homelessness crisis being debated during the provincial election.
It's not working, Mr. Horgan.
Thinking about how we are also experiencing a regression of our civic bonds and political ties, a breakdown of the trust that used to unify us, Bradotti reiterates such concerns about defamiliarization and renegotiation, explaining how we need to negotiate who we are, saying that we are indeed in this epistemic reshuffle together. Speaking particularly with regards to the technological shifts of artificial intelligence and biological manipulation in her book Morphing Intelligence, Catherine Malibu asks, do these metamorphoses amount to so many liberating transformations? Or do they signify a process of intensified despiritualization or desymbolization? Another example of the inevitability of starting from a flattened, homogeneous yet unifying perspective can be found in Mignolo's description of decoloniality as an epistemic reconstitution that assumes more than the socio-political and economic forms of domination usually discussed in conversations about coloniality, but which also addresses the cultural aspects and, of course, the epistemic and hermeneutical principles upon which Western religions, science, and philosophy were built.
That pick dresses that make you look expensive and elegant.
The development and spread of railroads across the United States brought a wave of changes to American life. During the railroad boom, thousands of jobs were created, new towns were born, trade increased, transportation was faster, and the overall landscape of the nation transformed. But perhaps the most interesting change of all is the least known, the establishment of standard time.
Perhaps it can be said that sparking the imagination of the creation of a global time and space through circumnavigating the globe and proselytizing the standardization of the Gregorian calendar. Colonialism itself was a primary global epistemic reconstitution.
We categorize people in registered and not registered. Exactly. It's something that I was thinking about, like, if our systems are making people illegal, how are we legal then? Like, what happens to us as legal? Like,
that's a very good question. But when we think about it from
nationalistic perspective. That's how they work here, and it's a pity that
so
the document.
So for us to have a document, we are actually participating in the system that makes other people undocumented.
Yes, unfortunately.
That's terrible.
It is very terrible. That's why I feel guilty and I contribute.
Whereas for Malibu, viewpoints are prior experiences crystallized into habits. For Mignolo, the habits of modernity and coloniality are implanted in all of us.
The Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola is one of America's most unusual prisons because it is, in some ways, a plantation. Once you pass through Angola's front gate, you can't help but feel that you've gone back in time to another South.
A terrifyingly unfathomable aspect of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was how soundless of a phenomena it actually was. How a city could just disappear was beyond comprehension for a baffled high command who were unaware of any raids. With all communications cut, the realization came only after the fact, when a reconnaissance plane reported back the destruction that had taken place. In Hyperobjects, Timothy Morton draws a parallel between the unfathomability of the losses consummated by such weapons of mass destruction with the disappearances forewarned by climate science. Seeing both events as perhaps being beyond the capability of human comprehension and control, Morton attempts to tune our senses to the slight discomforts that protrude from various peripheral perspectives of normality in order to heighten our senses to any possible reality, exemplified by that gulp of anxiety experienced while trying to maintain the niceties of routine conversation about the weather with a stranger on the bench of a park.
U.S. government secretly filmed the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not just from the sky, but the devastation on the ground brought that film back to the scientists at Los Alamos who did the Manhattan Project, made the bombs. And the reports are that these scientists threw up. They were vomiting as they saw this film, horrified, not understanding this would ever be used on Japan. Can you talk about everyone from Albert Einstein to J. Robert Oppenheimer and how they ultimately felt that film would be then highly classified for decades? Obviously not incriminating, not sharing nuclear secrets, but because of its huge effect.
Similar parallels and attempts to attune the senses can be found in Meeting the Universe Halfway, where Karen Barad contends with the moral dimensions of scientific discovery, particularly with regards to the creation of the atomic bomb. Useful contemplations for framing contemporary ethical considerations, like that of genomics and artificial intelligence. In The Mark of the Sacred, Jean-Pierre Dupuy also contends with such unfathomability as he assesses how contemporary disenchantment desensitizes and thrusts us further into an abyss where nuclear and ecological apocalypse become disturbing but apt examples for one another. Apocalyptic time is precisely the time of such an indefinite postponement, the time of freeze in between two deaths. In some sense, we are already dead, since the catastrophe is already here, casting its shadow from the future. After Hiroshima, we can no longer play the simple humanist game of insisting that we have a choice. It depends on us whether we follow the path of self-destruction or the path of gradual healing. All three authors employ a serious play with metaphor, with what Zizek and Benjamin refer to as messianic or Paulinian time.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has chosen me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and announce that the time has come when the Lord will save his people. This passage of Scripture has come true today, as you heard it being read.
The Scripture come true? But only the Messiah can fulfill that promise. So we know.
Once such a catastrophe has happened, we lose the innocence of such a position. We can only, indefinitely maybe, postpone its reoccurrence. As if having already fallen into this abyss, while being unaware of the echoing earlier warnings, like Bill McKibben's The End of Nature and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, we seem to have passed an event horizon. Perhaps we are merely reiterating a denial about an ecological apocalypse that has already rendered us non-existent.
I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean, we can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more, but come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it, taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
Many, if not most, business executives and political leaders today understand that radical changes in our way of life are the price that must be paid for avoiding disaster. But because this price, amounting to a renunciation of progress, seems to them exorbitant, they inevitably succumb to what the philosopher Gunther Andrews calls blindness towards the apocalypse. Whereas these thinkers view this blindness in terms of an insensitivity and disenchantment, Latour extends this idea by locating this incomprehension with an almost conspiratorial-sounding culpability and betrayal by obscurantist elites.
What mission?
Piece of our time.
In Witches, Terrorists, and Biopolitics of the Camp, Cynthia Baronese explains how an affective turn perhaps asks us to supplement our paranoid models with reparative ones, before concluding that sometimes what looks like paranoia may simply be a matter of having learned to see what is right in front of you. Yet, climate research has been a victim of a disturbing phenomenon.
It's a shadow government that's doing it.
What shadow government?
You don't know about the shadow government?
No.
Okay, you haven't heard of the Illuminati?
One of the big points a lot of people here want to make is that we, the news media, are part of the problem. They say we're fake news, we're controlled by the federal government and Bill Gates. Here's what they say when we walk in there.
Fake news. You guys lie all the time.
I'm from Eastern Bloc and I can tell you, I can smell fake news. Everything what you guys doing is manipulating the public.
The use of advanced marketing techniques to discredit scientific findings that may lead to consumer and regulatory behavior unfavorable to certain business interests. For Latour, these intentions become most visible on June 1st, 2017, when Donald Trump withdrew from the climate accord, as if proclaiming, "We Americans don't belong to the same earth as you. Yours may be threatened, ours won't be." Trump issued a declaration of war authorizing the occupation of all other countries, if not with troops, at least with CO2, which America retains the right to emit.
Withdraw, 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 withdraw,
I'm not going to lose it. Josh, in a nutshell, I want the cleanest water.
The Paris.
I want the cleanest air on Earth.
Climate Accord.
That's what we're doing.
A historic laughter, like the one given by world leaders during Trump's speech at the UN.
Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
seems like an adequate response to the many ways in which the era of Trump has unveiled the camp that lies at the heart of societies. An equally condemning conclusion has been reached by a former U.S. advisor on climate change, Gus Speth, who locates the problem of inaction not just in the realm of ignorance or within the canonical understanding of incentives, but retains spiritual depravity.
So this is really working within the system. This says that the system will deliver. If we try hard enough, if we work within this system, things will be fine. We'll eventually succeed. We're swimming upstream, but we'll get stronger and we'll prevail against the current. It turns out that's not what's happened.
I used to think that top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystems collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that.
Then we're up against a system that's condemning us to losing. We're playing a loser's game. And you have to ask, then don't we need to challenge the system?
The symbolic image of the globe through the image of the pale blue dot had a double effect of both humbling us in the presence of a universe while also working to validate our presence within modernity. This imagery is what Latour is responding to when he explains that we have never been modern. Instead, Latour invites us to reconceptualize the indestructible rock of the globe as a thin and relatively fragile terrestrial layer. Latour describes how this extraterrestrial point of view regulates the actions of some influential role models on this earth to resonate more with a hopeless renouncing of responsibility. In building walls, erecting gilded fortresses, filibustering political processes, gerrymandering, researching rockets to Mars, and attempting to teleport themselves into computers, some seem to be preparing for evacuations to survive an already inevitable apocalyptic climate apartheid.
I can't believe I destroyed the Earth.
Are you still talking about the Earth?
You're right. I gotta let it go.
Like how rich landholders would stoke racism as a means of maintaining their positions in society.
Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare. But the Europeans who preached a universal religion, and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians, needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society.
Rehashing age-old playbooks to prepare for an oncoming climate apartheid seems like an adequate strategy.
They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Nearly 2,000 children have been taken from their parents since Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced the policy.
I listen to him say naive, poor white people things. Man, Donald Trump's gonna go to Washington and he's gonna fight for us. I'm standing there thinking in my mind, you dumb motherfucker. You are poor. He's fighting for me.
Right. That's it then.
Goodbye. Good luck. Bye, Boris.
Take a counter on the baby, load a bread counter until the decade.
Latour analogizes the Titanic to describe how a ruling class who, being the first to know that the ship is sinking, reserve lifeboats for themselves, and ask the orchestra to go on playing lullabies so they can take advantage of the darkness to beat their retreat before the ship's increased listing alerts the other classes. Where ancient leaders were mythologized to lead armies into battle.
If your day be today, so be it. Mine will be tomorrow.
Citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations.
The influential people of contemporary life make decisions from behind.
And it is the space between you. Fight not for yourselves. Fight for that space. Fill that space. Make it tissue. Make it mass. Make it impenetrable. Make it yours. Make it England. Make it England.
People of Target, brothers, sisters, hear me now. They're standing out there. Any moment now, those doors will be breached. Whatever comes through those gates, you will stand your ground with a smile on your face. They come here with bargains in their heads and fire in their eyes, and we shall give those bargains to them. We will show them that we are not just the best store in this neighborhood, but the best store anywhere, because we are more than just a store. This is a team. This is a family. This is Target!
The rituals evoked by rising the ranks of our secular religions cultivate an insatiable economic vigilance and insecurity avoidant type of rationality, the most apt illumination of which became disclosed through the Panama Papers leak, which confirmed the untraceable expanses of tax fraud that envelops global economics, that reinforces the ruminations of desperation which our economic system already rewards, while also building bunkers that keep themselves safe from any lines of fire and potential uprisings. Perhaps if so-called we wish to cultivate a critical orientation to the sensibility of belonging on this earth, we may follow Zizek's suggestion of the landfill to be an appropriate point of inspiration.
This is where we should start feeling at home.
By starting from the post-apocalyptic and messianic time, from the farthest point of conceivability, from an imagination that is completely peripheral from our habituations, yet simultaneously and totally within the bounds of the fate of civilizations, we can be attuned to what Karen Barai describes as a call to resist the anti-earth ideologies and theologies that are devouring us. For claims of universality are at best useful fictions. Mignolo discusses the methodology of taking up universal fictions, which are described as being effective fictions and not claims to truth, without parentheses. An apt example of such an attempt is found in Frantz Fanon's reach towards a potential universality from his own position of particularity when taking up the master's tool of nationalism.